So welcome to the first of hopefully a series of discussions which aims to talk about some of the common questions about the anti-racism movement generally and also in our local area. Some of the questions are those which have been repeatedly asked on forums such as Hexham Matters, while others have been sent to us directly. And as many of you will know, alongside the Black Lives Matter movement, which has kind of grown globally, numerous discussions have been sparked on our local Facebook group, Hexham Matters. And following the success of the recent peaceful demonstration in Hexham, we'd like to provide kind of a positive space for those who would like to learn more about the anti-racism movement and how it is relevant to all of us. Before we start, I'd just like to acknowledge that this group is largely white, but through this discussion, we hope to raise awareness that even if you are from a white and/or privileged environment, you can still play a role in addressing racial injustice and inequality, and stand in solidarity with Black, Indigenous, and people of colour in Hexham and beyond. Of course, this is a learning process for us all, including me. So just a disclaimer that these are all just our views, and this is an open discussion to kind of share ideas. Having said that, we are still keen to broaden the diversity of this little question and answer team. So feel free to get in touch if you'd like to be involved either via Facebook or I'll share the link in the email of in the description of this video. So I think that's it for a little kind of brief introduction on what we're about. We've got 5 questions to start us off, and I'll just be moderating this discussion, and everyone will kind of be chipping in with their ideas. So yeah, perfect. So I think we're all ready to get going. So we'll head straight on to the first question, which is, how is the anti-racism movement relevant to Hexham? And I think we're going to go to Becca first on this one. So Becca.
Hello. So I think I have 2 answers to this question, and the first one is the short one. You know, the answer lies in the testimonies of the Black people and the people of colour who live in Hexham, who have told us their experiences in Hexham and in the northeast. One woman's story was told at the demonstration a couple of weeks ago, and I think it was in the Quran as well. And that is like one of the many untold stories that obviously we haven't heard. And so the anti-racism movement is relevant here because it's still connected.
I think you've just broken up a little bit at the end. So if you could just repeat what you said at the end. No, don't worry, don't worry.
It just said my Wi-Fi's gone off. So yeah, I think the short answer to that question is just that racism exists here. People suffer from it every single day, and it's our responsibility as a community, as a strong community that we are, to work to eradicate that racism so that people, our neighbours here in Hexham, don't have to suffer anymore. But I would say, to answer that question, there's a second thing that is quite important as well, which is that I think racism is not just like individual actions that you can kind of see and point at and be like, right, that's racism, he was racist then. It's like, it's bigger than that. It's a whole entire system. It's a system of prejudiced beliefs against people of colour that are upheld by institutions of power. And those institutions are the ones that are integral to our society, like the police and the healthcare system and the education system, and all of these things are built upon a racial hierarchy. And that means that racism exists absolutely everywhere, like within people and between people. And, you know, if it exists everywhere, that means it needs to be dismantled everywhere. Just because, you know, someone might not be a person who knowingly or intentionally acts in racist ways, they've still been born into this society, and that means like it's still embedded in them. It's embedded in our society, so it's embedded on all of us. And I think if you believe that racism should be eradicated and dismantled, you should believe that everywhere, wherever you are, including in Hexham. You know, just because obviously at the minute the current momentum of the anti-racist movement around the world has been sparked by one event in America. That's not what the whole movement is. It's so much bigger than that. It's about the whole system. And that means that it's our responsibility here in Hexham to dismantle that just as much as it is anyone else's responsibility anywhere else. So yeah.
Thank you, Becca. I think that's a really important point, that to recognise that racism isn't always explicit, but it's also implicit in these systems that are built around us. And the fact that obviously, while George Floyd was the kind of trigger for this movement, it has, of course, been ongoing for years and years, and there have been movements in the past, in history, and it is really an ongoing issue. I'll just ask the rest of the group if anyone else wants to contribute to this question. So the question was, how is the anti-racism movement relevant to Hexham? Okay, cool. I think we'll go on to the next question then. So, talking about racism is so divisive. Wouldn't it be better if we just saw everyone as people and stopped obsessing over race? And I think, first of all, we're going to go over to Sophie.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, this is a really interesting question, isn't it? Because I think you have to look at what we mean by divisive. Talking about race shouldn't be divisive. Talking about racism and race, you know, these things are facts, they're proven. We can kind of put that aside and then move on, I think. But I think, unfortunately, because the way that this conversation's happening now, firstly, it involves a lot more white people than it ever has before, or particularly a lot more visibly, because of the fact that a lot of it is happening on social media. And it's also involving a lot more people with a lot less understanding of racism. And I'm including myself in that, as a person who's white and has grown up with mainly white friends, schooled in a mainly white school, in workplaces with mainly white people. Racism simply has not directly affected me. And because of that, I think I have to confront my own privilege, which is that I've got to the age of 30 without feeling any pressure to talk about racism. I've been able to, if I wanted, completely opt out of that conversation. And I think whether we're talking about, you know, direct prejudice, which I think is a kind of old-fashioned, like you were saying, Tess, like the old-fashioned idea of racism, you know, racial attacks or racial slurs, or, you know, people directly being racist. That's a kind of old-fashioned idea of what racism is, I think, and perhaps we need to find new language to discuss that, going back to calling it prejudice maybe, so that when we're talking about racism, when we're talking about systemic racism and institutional racism, which is proven and it is a fact, there's no room for, you know, like a margin for error. I think there's so much misunderstanding, misinterpretation, and the fact that we're discussing this predominantly on social media, this is maybe the first time that we've ever had such a huge civil rights movement be based on social media before, has made the conversation very difficult, because we're not talking to a whole person. We're talking to just a representation of what we think that person is based on that one thing that maybe they've said. And it's a natural human thing to kind of build a context in your head, I think, of who is this person that's saying this thing that I don't agree with, and you pick out all of these other things in your head that you also don't agree with, and you attribute them to that person, and that means that the conversation's over and there's no way to productively continue. So I think that that's something, as anti-racist activists, that we need to think about. How do we productively use social media in order to have a conversation that is not divisive and that it's productive? So I do think that we need to take some criticism on the chin in that respect. However, I also think a big part of not talking about racism and being very polite about the whole thing and getting away with it, kind of, is white privilege. And we can't continue avoiding saying that. You know, it's, as a white person, very uncomfortable to confront our own complicity in a system that kills people, that makes people's lives much more difficult than ours are. You know, it's not a nice thing to have to confront. However, it's unavoidable. And if we want to build a society that is fully inclusive, that is fair, it's completely unavoidable to talk about it, to talk about the issue of race, to talk about the issue of racism. I just think we have to get better at it. And I think, unfortunately, that means that people like me, white people, have to do a lot more work on themselves to be prepared for these conversations, because otherwise they are going to be divisive. And if we can't come in with a good understanding of our own bias, even as people who would consider themselves anti-racist, we need to understand that we've been born into a system that has conditioned us and socialized us to have racial bias. And that I think if we can get away with the polarizing idea that anti-racist equals good and racist equals bad, and that you can only be racist or have racial bias if you're a bad person, I think it's so unproductive. And we need to kind of get back to some compassion in this conversation, so that everybody feels like they have a voice, and that includes white people, I think. I think that's kind of all I have to say about it. Basically, that we can't opt out of this conversation anymore. There is no choice to opt out of talking about racism. And if we are honest in our intentions and honest in our actions, we have to talk about it. And it doesn't matter if it feels uncomfortable, really. Like, it feels a lot more uncomfortable for many other people in the world that we are not talking about it than it does for us to talk about it. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Sophie. That was a great answer. And I was just also thinking about how often racism is kind of sandwiched together with politics, and it's often a really politicized issue. And of course, politics is polarizing in itself. And I think it's really important to also draw a distinction on, racism doesn't have to be political. Racism exists, okay, politics exists, but they're not the same entity. And I think often looking at conversations that have been had across social media, people are very quick to say, oh, I don't want to have a political discussion when we're talking about race, but it's not necessarily a political issue. And by sandwiching it together with politics, it is automatically going to make it divisive. That's an interesting point. Does anyone else want to chip in on that question? I'll just read out the question again. So, talking about racism is so divisive. Wouldn't it be better if we saw everyone as people and stopped obsessing over race? Does anyone else want to join in with that one?
I'll add to that, Tess.
Okay, cool.
I just think that in addition, obviously the whole point in having that conversation is unity, like at the heart, the fact that we have to talk about this system because that's what is in place to divide us. But everybody who is on the side of this movement and is with this movement, nobody is wanting more division, nobody is wanting special treatment directly for Black people. I think we had this discussion in our group saying that, pro-Black movements aren't anti-white movements. People just assume that because lots of pro-white movements have been anti-Black. And no, it's not about dividing people even further. It's purely just about coming together, and we need to have these difficult discussions so that we can come together. And that is our end goal, basically. So it might be difficult to start with, but the more we keep talking, the easier it's going to be.
Yeah, that's a really great point to make. Anyone else? Nope. Okay, we'll go on to the next question. So, my life has been very hard. How can you say I'm privileged? We're going to go over to Katie first of all.
Great, thank you. So the first thing I wanted to stress is something that has already been mentioned quite a lot, and that is that white privilege doesn't mean that white people don't struggle and face challenges in life. It simply means that white people haven't had to face additional challenges due to the colour of their skin. And there's a lot of misconceptions about the term white privilege, so hopefully I can give a brief overview of what white privilege is, how it presents itself in society, but also touch on how the white working class are encouraged to choose their own racial sort of status interests over common interests with Black and minority ethnic communities, and how this prevents movements that would enable society to be free from racial hierarchy. So it prevents people from coming together. So white privilege is a term that was first coined by a woman called Peggy McIntosh, and she's an American scholar, a feminist and anti-racist activist. And in 1988, she described white privilege as an invisible package of unheard assets that I can rely on each day, but about which I was meant to remain oblivious. She's a white lady, so this is a perspective. White privilege was a term that's coined by a white person. So I think it's quite hard for a lot of white people to accept this term, because they feel like it's denying them certain, like a status of being an oppressed person or being someone who's faced challenges. But I'm really hoping that we can avoid that. So Peggy McIntosh talked about examples of white privilege. Some of these are, I can be pretty sure that my neighbours in such a location will be neutral and pleasant to me. And this is something that was mentioned in the last rally when Marie's statement was read out, saying that she felt unsafe with her neighbours and that they discriminated against her, and that she was trying to find somewhere safe to live, and that is just something that we as white people don't have to even think about. More examples. She says, I do not have to educate my children to be aware of systemic racism for their own daily physical protection. I am never asked to speak for all the people of my racial group. So there's a wealth of academic research that shows how white privilege actually presents itself in society. A study by Diva Pega into the effects of race in hiring decisions in America found that white men with a criminal record were actually more likely to receive a job offer than a black man without a criminal record, demonstrating powerful effects of race on employment. She said that being black in America today is essentially like having a felony conviction in terms of one's chances of finding employment. And although this is in the US, there is a lot of evidence that shows how like BAME individuals are discriminated against here. For example, the Guardian newspaper conducted a study that showed that UK employers were consistently more likely to choose a CV with the name Dave compared to a CV with the name Mohammed. These examples of white privilege demonstrate how life as a white person comes with certain unearned advantages that are denied to people from minority ethnic backgrounds. This isn't to say that white people don't endure suffering. Indeed, the situation for the working classes is in need of radical reform, in my opinion. But as Michelle Alexander says, who is the woman who wrote The New Jim Crow, she said that suffering for white people isn't linked to a belief in his inherent inferiority. And I think that's a really important point to make, that while it's a very hard pill for some white people to swallow, that they do have these privileges, it is human nature to like cling to advantages in life, I think. It's really important that we learn about underlying racial hierarchy that exists in our society, like Becca was talking about, in the institutions that have built this society that we live in now. And if we learn about it, not just to recognize it, but to address it, that we can actually understand the cause, then understand how to change it and restructure our society to benefit people, provide them with the necessary means to live a good life. Frederick Douglass said that power concedes nothing without demand, and I think this is still true today, that without strong collective action from everybody and acceptance of the racial injustices that exist now in our society, that without accepting that and addressing it, we can't live in a world where oppressed people are free.
Great, thank you, Katie. It's really interesting to see like where the history of the term white privilege originates, and how it's not mutually exclusive with the lack of hardship, which I think often is misunderstood. I also think a good example of this is with the recent report from the government on COVID-19 in BAME communities, and I think that's a perfect demonstration of how these inequalities do persist. And of course, white people aren't excluded from the burden of the virus, but BAME groups are more at risk due to these ingrained inequalities. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting point to make. Okay, I think we'll go on to the next question. So the next question is, we are in the middle of a pandemic, why now? And we're going to go over to Nema for this question. So I'll pass you over.
Hi. So COVID-19 has completely shook the world. We've been in lockdown and isolated in a way that we never would have imagined that would happen within our lifetimes. We're witnessing the economy struggle and being given confusing and unclear instructions from those who are meant to be leading us. Many people have lost jobs and loved ones because of government failures, and so people are angry and they're frustrated. With all the troubles faced by the majority of the population and the lack of support from the government, social and political issues are made ever more clear. We watched George Floyd murdered on the 25th of May. This was never the first case of such racism, but it was the catalyst for events and movements that have followed. It caused us in the UK to recognise the injustices that exist within our society, recognise the ingrained and institutionalised racism that exists everywhere, recognise racism that the British Empire was built on top of. We're recognising these issues of racism because they're exacerbated by the pandemic. Unemployment rates are rising. Black people are already facing a higher rate of unemployment than their white counterparts, and they face many more issues when even trying to get a job because of internalised racism. The fact that Black and Asian people, I think, are 4 times more likely to die from COVID-19 also clearly highlights how institutionalised racism affects our healthcare system. We also need to recognise that police brutality is not just an American problem. Black people, I think this is the statistic, are nearly 10 times more likely to be stopped and searched by police. We have cases of violence and murder too, and to name a few names are Sarah Reid, Darlene Atkinson, and Julian Cole. These are only a tiny portion of the extent that racism is ingrained within our society, and it's important that we address them now as we start to rebuild our country post-pandemic. We need to consciously rebuild it with the best intentions to eradicate and dismantle the racism that is embedded within our society. We have voices and we need to use them, regardless of our race, sexuality, age, ability, gender, etc. During this pandemic, the British public has come together to do our best in such hard times. We've seen people helping each other and celebrating each other. And we've seen a real unity and connection in the face of a common enemy, COVID-19. We need to continue to appreciate one another and recognise the value in every human life and use that same camaraderie against racism.
Thank you. That was a really, really powerful answer. And as you pointed out, there are so many stark examples of the inequalities that exist and how they've been exacerbated by COVID-19. And I really think it's interesting how you spoke about the unity that has occurred because of COVID-19 and how that really could be directed to the anti-racism movement and to creating a more just world, really. So thank you. That was really, really great answer. Does anyone else want to contribute to that question?
Could I just, with the question of why now in a global pandemic as well, I feel like it could also that could be discussed is at the beginning of the pandemic, I think we all saw online a lot of racism towards Asian people because of where the pandemic originated from. I mean, I continue to hear comments of, I still won't eat from a Chinese takeaway from certain people online. So when you say, like, why now during a global pandemic, racial injustice is continuing during a global pandemic. Why not now? It's still going on, and discussing it now there's no reason to not discuss it now. It's just getting highlighted now, so we might as well use the momentum.
Yeah, I think that is really, really great point to make. Like, why not now? And I think as this movement builds, we really want to create that momentum and continue it, and make sure that this does create lasting change, because of course there have been movements in the past that are forgotten, in history. And I think it is really, really important that we do create change and we change things for a better future. So thanks, Vicky. That's really great. Sorry. Yeah, go on.
I think that it's also important that we recognise it's not a new movement at all, and it's something that's been happening since colonialist times, and people have been speaking up against this. And every time, it might feel like we're not successful each time, but we are, because every time we do this type of thing, we grow a bit more, but it's not fixed. And we can't have 400 years of it not being fixed. This is the time when we have enough understanding and enough access to sources and all of these opportunities and things that have come with the aging of the times that we can access and use in order to just get rid of it. Like, we don't need, it's not beneficial right now. Like, we could live without racism. We don't need it. And I think that it's important that we recognise that this is something we can all do together, and this is the perfect time for us to do it as we do start to rebuild our lives and rebuild everything, because we can just rebuild it without racism and it'll be gone. And I think that we should take this opportunity by the horns, and I don't know what that analogy was going to be, but we should do something like that. But yeah, I do think that's important.
That's really great, and it's such a good kind of positive twist on what can be quite a kind of negative and almost, I don't know, it can really drag you down, like, thinking about it. And I think it's really great to keep it like a positive movement, and that we can create change. And like you said, it's easier now more than ever to, you know, go online, educate yourself, talk to people, you know, as we're doing this virtually, you can see that. So yeah, that's really great. Okay, anyone else before we move on to the next one?
Can I just say as well that I think another way to spin the question is, rather than ask people, you know, why now, ask yourself, like, what is so important to people that they want to risk their health and the health of their families to go out and protest and to be visible and put themselves in these positions? Because I think that when we get defensive about things, it's quite easy to try and dehumanize other people or deny the fact that they also have the same central values that we have. And it's quite easy to think, oh, you know, well, these people doing this are ridiculous. But actually, it's the fact that the cause in hand is so important to us and so vital that we act on it now. That is why we are going out now, and that is why we are campaigning now, risking the people around us and ourselves. So I think that's an important way to look at it.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Okay, we're going to go on to the next question now. So we're going to go back to Jenna, and the next question is, does Hexham Against Racism support the political statements of Black Lives Matter UK, and in particular its calls to defund the police and dismantle capitalism? So it's quite a loaded question, I think, so we'll go over to Jenna.
Well, I can't speak for absolutely everybody in this group, but I will definitely speak for myself and speak from the point of somebody who's actively anti-racist, in the hopes that that's why you guys are obviously all here. I want to start by saying that to defund the police absolutely categorically does not mean to get rid of the police. It does not mean that we want to have no police. We want to open all prisons and effectively ask society to police themselves. What it means is, it means that we want to call for an overall restructuring of how we look at policing, how we understand crime, and how we understand deviance. I think that it's important to acknowledge that just because the movement started in America, lots of the discourse and the dialogue surrounding what's going on obviously is heavily focused in America, but can also be applied to the UK. And I can completely sympathise with people who are a bit confused and think, you know, facing austerity, the police have faced some really horrific cuts, and we all know how stretched the police are. But I think a lot of that comes from our expectations of the police, and realising the fact that the police as a service at the minute are responsible for so many things above simply just enforcing the law. And it's kind of things that they're not really the best people to be approaching and to be tackling. It's things such as mental health, domestic issues that we don't need the police to respond to. So rather than kind of taking money away from them, it's about investing in our communities. It's about realizing that crime is not purely the product of the individual. It is also to do with our environment. And the more that we invest in our environments and look at things such as unemployment, poverty, and housing, then we are less likely to need the kind of influence of the police to enforce the law, because things like being poor are not a crime, and, you know, having domestic issues, obviously some things do clearly need the response of the police. But when you look at how many increased calls there are to the police for mental health issues, we don't need those people feeling like they're criminal. We need to give them help, and we need to give them other services that, like I say, if we had more of an investment in, we wouldn't need the police. So that's what I kind of really want to emphasize for the defund the police point. I can see that in America, you know, they have a lot of spending on their police forces, and obviously that is taxpayers' money. So it is about a restructuring and looking at how we are spending that money. And like Nema was saying about how disproportionately targeted people of colour are by the police in this country as well. It's not, we can't think that the UK is innocent, because it isn't. So that is why the movement is also important in the UK. And I think that its ties to capitalism come from the fact that capitalism obviously requires individualism and requires, well, Britain and America are both capitalist states, and it requires us to look at things from the points of business. And when we look at things from the points of business, we don't necessarily look at fairness, and there is the opportunity for exploitation. And looking at things such as the prison system, if you look at the incarceration rates in America, you can see exactly how disproportionate that is. And there are similar instances in the UK, looking at the population size compared people of colour compared to how many are incarcerated. It's very, very disproportionate. So the link to capitalism is about the individualism, because that is what makes us believe that crime is in the individual, and that, you know, we are all individually responsible for things, rather than looking at the environments that we belong to. And I think that the call to kind of like get rid of that mindset is to start taking responsibility for the other people around us. And I don't think that that's something that purely is beneficial just within our movement. I think it's something that's beneficial for many people to start looking after each other and to stop just trying to make money out of each other.
Thank you so much, Jenna. That was a really great answer. It's really interesting how, like you said, the discourse is focused in America, but of course it's relevant to the UK because there are so many parallels, for example, being a capitalist state. And while there are similarities, it's also not a one-size-fits-all approach. So of course we can look at the Black Lives Matter movement and think, okay, there's some really great things they're doing and really great things they're addressing here, but okay, maybe not all of them are relevant to the UK. And, you know, it's not a blanket thing, you know. And like you said, like tackling the root cause by redirecting police funding to community-based programs, for example, for mental health, is really, you know, what this statement kind of is meaning. You know, it's not as black and white as defund the police. You know, it is. You know, yeah. And I think that simplification can be misunderstood. So it's really great that you've provided like an expansion on that.
Channel 4 have put together a really great video that I definitely recommend if anyone wants to. If someone's a more like statistic kind of person, I'm really like think it through. But if someone's more statistical, then you can go and watch that and definitely just search up like defund the police, what does it mean or something, and it was really informative. So extra resource if you're looking for that.
Oh, perfect. We can even put a link to it with the video description. That would be really good. Yeah. Cool.
Could I just expand on what Jenna was saying? I wish that I had the time to look up this beforehand. I'm pretty sure off the top of my head it's Oregon in America. Had done some work years ago where they'd started for mental health crises, sending out, rather than like 2 police officers, because police officers don't work alone, sending out a medic or a mental health practitioner with them to respond to mental health calls. And the rates of people, a quick Google will show you the answers. I finished work late, I didn't have a chance to pull them up beforehand. A quick Google will show you that the rates of people being incarcerated for these calls have like greatly reduced, and instead people got the appropriate mental health support that they actually needed, because someone who was actually trained in the field was going out with a police officer in case things got worse to deal with the situation, rather than 2 police officers, which also just causes a lot of fear for the individual straight off the bat. So there is work being done that shows that multidisciplinary working and redirecting funds into other services like health work and social workers and other things like that does have really positive impacts on communities.
Yeah.
That's a really, really great example. Jenna, did you want to say anything else?
I just wanted to add as well that it's kind of like, I think that the approach that we have at the moment is very reactive, and it requires crime and difficulties to happen before like we can actually change things. And I think that people often underestimate crime prevention and prevention strategies because they're harder to see. It's harder to see how we are preventing crime from happening. It's easier to see it and then see our approach to stop it than it is to look at how the measures we are putting in place prevent it. But everybody knows, like, throughout the country, we've had so many community centres close, so many really vital services within our communities that have closed down, and then we haven't seen, you know, we've seen crime rise, or we've seen like it stagnate. And I think that it's important to really reflect on the fact that we don't need to simply respond. We can put our energy and put our effort into preventing these things from happening in the first place. And that's what this kind of movement is about. And that's the kind of efforts and energy that we want, kind of thing.
Yeah, I think it's really important to make that distinction between kind of prevention, and then just reacting. And I think in lots of aspects of society, we're so used to reacting when it gets to crisis point, when actually the best kind of scenario for everyone is to tackle those root causes. So yeah, that's really great. Oh, Sophie, go ahead.
Sorry, just something that Jenna said, like making little fireworks going off in my brain here. I was just thinking about the idea that living in a country where austerity has been, you know, the norm for probably for us most of our lives, actually. There's such a feeling of scarcity and fear and protection of what we have and what we own and our safety. And for a lot of people, especially a lot of people who are white, the feeling is that the police protect that for us. And I think getting an understanding of the fact that a lot of people don't feel protected by the police, and that they don't have that relationship with police is important. But also a kind of parallel would be to think about another emergency service. So we've already talked about healthcare, but one that isn't considered relevant at all in this conversation. Let's talk about firefighters. So we look at the Grenfell Tower disaster, for example, and we look at the issues with this kind of housing, which was predominantly affecting non-white people because that's who was living there. We don't look at disasters like that and think, we need more firefighters. That's going to solve that problem. Let's put loads of money into the fire service, then they can put all the fires out. We look at housing, we look at why are people living in houses that aren't fit for purpose and that are dangerous and that everybody knows are dangerous, and waiting until they burst into flames to solve the problem. And I think that, although it's maybe a crude kind of metaphor, it can definitely be layered onto the police, and thinking that those preventative strategies are just as important in policing as they are in any other, in healthcare or in any other kind of disaster management, I guess. But yeah, that was really interesting, Jenna. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie. I think we'll move on to the final question, the final question of today anyway. So the last question is, what difference can I make? And I'm just going to open this up to the floor and see if anyone has any answers they'd like to give.
Can I go? I've been thinking about this a lot recently, and through forms of other connections that I've been making, which would just be a bit too big right now. But I think that it's really important that there's a lot of emphasis on looking at ourselves and our own behaviour, and that goes for every single person. I know we talk about recognising white privilege, but this also means recognising any form of privilege that you have and using that position within society to affect a better change, or like to affect things getting better. I think we can really look at how we conduct ourselves, what type of internalized racism or prejudice that we have, and start to really do the personal work to get rid of that. It's a lot of relearning and unlearning patterns. These are patterns of like, and that you picked up from the minute you went into the education system or the minute you were born even. And it's really analysing how you can change those and how they actually affect the real world and the real situation that you're in, and how that has a knock-on effect to other people's situations. I think that the personal work is the most important work, because once you start affecting change in yourself, it's like a domino effect to those around you and those around them. I think taking the time to do the research and the learning and unlearning is very important. I mean, for example, we look at what the history we were taught in school, and then we look at the real history, and we need to learn to unlearn what we've learned in order to relearn new information. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with admitting that you got something wrong, because it's not necessarily your fault 100% of the time. Like, we all went through the same education system pretty much, and we all were told these things over and over again. Of course we're going to think that's the truth, but it's like, you go and do A-level history, for example, and they tell you to look at the source. If the source is racist, if the education system is racist, then how are you knowing that what you're learning is not biased? So you need to then relearn that whole history. And that goes for everything, like the way you, like cultural appropriation in dress, like in fashion, in makeup, how you present yourself on social media, what words you want to use when singing your favorite songs. It comes down to everything. Just take these things out. It will not affect your life to change those little tiny things, but it will affect the lives for the better for people who may not have the same privileges as you. So I think that it really is about personal work and encouraging personal work in those around you. And if everyone does this, we do have a domino effect, and it will affect the wider society. Doing the things you can as you go, and just learning and learning constantly. It's fine to get things wrong, and it's fine to relearn things. Just keep being active. It doesn't have to be on your mind all the time, but you do need to keep doing it all the time. Yeah.
Thank you. And I think, you know, it can be really daunting, you know, to step outside the box and kind of reflect on yourself and admit kind of that not everything you know is the truth. But yeah, how it's important to actually make the time to relearn, and to educate yourself. And with time, you know, you'll grow in confidence, and actually you'll be able to make those changes. So thanks, Nema, that was really, really good. Does anyone else want to? Yeah, Becca?
I would just say, to like add on to that, I think, like, practically, it sounds a bit daft, but like, write it all down. Like, when you're doing it, like, think about it and then write it all down, and then, like, you don't need to show anyone or anything like that. But I think, you know, I found myself like, you know, I've read a lot of books and seen lots of things online, and I thought I was all dead, like, clued up and stuff. But like, until you like look at all this stuff that you've learned, and then like look at yourself and be like, right, and now when have I done that? What do I do all the time that like perpetuates that, all these things? And then like write it down, and then like keep it there, you know. Literally, it's just like, I think there's something about, you know, being really, really active about it and really like deliberate and stuff. Do you know what I mean? Like, yeah, use it as like a practice. You know, we like spend all this time in school like learning. You can do a little bit more learning. You know, really study it, and like, yeah. There's a lot of books you can get as well, like workbooks online. There's one called Me and My White Supremacy, which is like, I'm sure it's really good. But that kind of exercise of like learning and then like applying to yourself, and just like looking at yourself really, you know, openly, and like all the ugly stuff as well.
Thanks, Becca. I think, yeah, that sounds really beneficial, especially because, you know, especially over the last kind of few months when this movement's kind of blown up, you can be bombarded with so much information, you kind of lose track and order, you know, and it sounds like it would be really beneficial to write that down. And I also think that after this video, we can maybe put some links to some of those resources, like that book that you mentioned, so that it's nice and easy for people to, you know, do a little bit of reading or watch a video, etc., whatever kind of suits them. Yeah, Nema, we'll go back to you.
Sorry, I just had a little Becca kind of made my brain go. I think it's also, anyone can do this kind of, you can call it activist work, but really it's just changing your behaviour. I think it can even be down to what type of arts and what type of things you support that aren't to do with racism or like these race topics. And it can even just be watching films that are by Black directors, or shopping from non-white owned stores and businesses, like these things that will have a really big effect on racism in the long run. And it's not just like, we can do more than just learn about it. We can go and actively support these communities, which would probably, they're going to be just as good, if not better, in some cases. Like, you can still go and do this, support, get involved, you don't have to be talking about race to be anti-racist. You can go and you can help out other communities, not in a saviorist type of way, just in terms of being wary of where you shop, what you're watching, what type of entertainment you're engaging with. All these little things that we take for granted every day, we can just be more cautious of, and we can redirect our money, our attention to give these voices a new platform. And that is going to be really beneficial for an anti-racism movement to move and flow consistently over time, until eventually we're not talking about anti-racism, we're just talking about life or the next problem that comes along. But you know, we don't need to, basically that's
it's really good to hear some like practical examples, you know, of what people can do, and how it doesn't have to be difficult, and it doesn't have to be extravagant, you know, it can just form part of your everyday life. I also just wanted to kind of emphasize that we shouldn't underestimate the power of civil society. And I think it's easy to say, oh, we can't make a difference, like it's up to the government, you know, my actions won't create change. But I think actually these kind of protests, demonstrations, whatever you'd like to call them, have really emphasized that we can, as a collective, create change. And that's already, we can see, you know, okay, slowly, but justice is happening, you know, and we just need to keep this ball rolling. Even if it feels like as an individual, you know, you're so small and you can't do much, but actually acting as a collective, we can. So if everyone just makes those small changes, it will really make a difference. Anyway, does anyone else want to contribute to that final question? Oh, Jenna, yeah. You're on mute, Jenna.
I just want to say, in perspective of Hexham and in the perspective of our local community, I feel there's a lot that we can do here. And it's great to look, you know, on a global scale. It's great to look on a national scale. But right here, right now, I think the best thing is just kindness and just joy, and realizing that there are a lot of people of colour who live in Hexham and the surrounding areas. And as much as we're part of this community, like just like everybody else, if you do see us out and about, give us a smile, say hello, like be nice, you know, just kind of everyone, the more we can come together and have positive spaces where it's fun, like to just be out and about, and like it's comfortable and nice to go places and to meet new people. That would be great. I'm not saying I've got no friends, because I do, but it would be nice to just kind of be able to meet random new people and have a conversation without thinking like, oh, like, are they looking at me funny because I'm brown or whatever? Yeah, that would just be great. And I feel like the more we can work on that as a community, getting rid of those stares, getting rid of the stigma. And, you know, if you do find something really great that you want to share, I'm more than happy for a chat. If you want to come over, say hello. Nema's not that friendly, so maybe don't bother with her. Not joking. But yeah, there needs to be a positive aspect to it, where we can use these things that we're reading about, use these things that we're learning about in our own locality and in our own local area to make Hexham a really lovely, anti-racist, supporting and supportive place.
Thank you so much, Jenna.
I am friendly.
No, but that's a really important point to make, that, you know, it is about kindness and just creating like an inclusive environment, you know, where everyone feels welcomed and doesn't feel like they're kind of singled out as different, you know, because kind of, you know, everyone can kind of open their minds to educating themselves, and it doesn't really matter where you're from, you can still make a difference. Cool. I'll just ask everyone if there's any other comments they'd like to make for this first discussion. Yes, Sophie, go ahead.
I'm going to keep it brief because I think I've talked enough. But just like slightly building on what Jenna just said, I think in terms of looking at anti-racism work as a positive adding sort of movement as opposed to a negative removing movement, we don't have to be experts in anti-racism or in activism or in Black history or in colonialism. It's good to educate ourselves, but we don't have to be experts. It's not realistic, but we are all experts in something in our own little worlds. And whether that's what we're employed in or whether it's the groups that we take part in, we can always, I think, look around the room and think whose voice is missing here and why. an example of that is that I work as a makeup artist. So it's not, you know, it's not an activist space, but what I can easily do is I can look around at my colleagues and I can think, why isn't this a terribly diverse space? Or, you know, whose voices is missing here? What offering is missing, and how can we kind of resolve that? And I think especially in a place like Hexham, where if we look at kind of like tourism and nature, and say you're like a Boy Scouts leader, for example, and you're looking around, you're thinking, is this a welcoming space for, you know, non-white kids? I think everybody has their own little expertise in their own world, and I think that is how we can really make change, is by enacting these things in our sphere of influence.
Yeah, that's a really good point to make, Sophie. I think it's about not just accepting the norm, you know, and really challenging and questioning that norm, and maybe that norm isn't the right thing, you know. So yeah, that's a really great point to make. I think we've been through all of the questions for today. I'd just like to thank anyone who's watching, and obviously all you guys for taking part and contributing some really great and constructive answers and comments. And like I said before, if anyone else wants to get involved, I'll put the email address in the description of the video. And we would like to kind of increase the diversity of this group and just make sure that everyone's voice is heard. You can also send any questions that you have for future discussions to that email address, and they'll all be kept anonymous. So yeah, I think that's it from me, and we'll link any resources that we've mentioned in the description too. So yeah, thanks everyone. It was good.
Thank you.
Thanks.